Okay, fun effect to play with, but there are a couple problems. One, you might have noticed that we've got a black fringe around this frame. Unfortunately, Compound Blur does not have a Preserve Edge Pixels option. So if you're going to use it, make sure that your edges are either going to be buried outside of an action-safe area so the viewer won't see it, or if necessary, you might need to scale up the image just a little bit to get the blur results outside of your frame. Go a bit further there till we start to bury some of the results. The second problem I have with this blur is that it's just not very high quality. I'll turn off my safe areas and pick something like that nice horizontal blur map that I had, turn off the invert. As I crank up the blur amount, you'll notice that I've got a sort of very grungy, boxy, linear line effect out in the highly blurred areas. Compound Blur unfortunately does not have a very high quality. That's another problem that I might have with this. Let's go ahead and set it to something like 25. Take a snapshot, Shift plus F5, so I can remember what this looks like. And let me show you an alternative to Compound Blur. There's another blur effect that we're going to talk about later called lens blur. Lens blur has two purposes in life. One, to recreate the effects of a natural camera lens and the shutter aberrations you would get in the blur. And two, to be a compound blur. It has something called a depth map layer. So if I go ahead and pick the same blur map, increase the blur radius, I find that lens blur needs roughly 4 times the setting that compound blur does. Give it a moment to render because lens blur is one of the slower blurs out there. Here we come. Now that it's done, you'll see that the details in these trees are much smoother than they were with Compound Blur. And just to compare, I'm going to press F5 to recall my snapshot. That's Compound Blur, and now you can see all the artifacts going on, particularly in these bright areas. Release F5, and now you see I have a much smoother, more natural blur off in these edges. So if you need to do critical high quality work with Compound Blur, I'd use the lens blur effect instead. Now, in addition to these creative applications we've been showing here, Compound Blur is very useful to visual effects artists as well. In a 3D program, you can often render what's known as a depth map or a Z-depth map that shows how far objects are away from the camera. This usually creates a grayscale image. Well, you can use that grayscale image with an effect such as Compound Blur to vary the amount of blur in your scene based on how far objects are away from the camera. Just keep in mind that Compound Blur does have some quality limitations. If you're really critical, check out Lens Blur instead.